Well, I have been working very hard specifically on trying to come up with how the spell casting, mage on mage or mage on monster, how that combat system is going to work. And it's been difficult. I've had a lot of things that I thought were interesting, such as, dynamically altering spells using gestures, specifically not choosing spells with complex gestures like shapes or circles, but adjusting them in a very kind of Minority Report, handheld, or I should say touchscreen type interfaces. So like you slide your hand to the right and a very small amount to adjust the damage or range or AoE or something like that. So I've been experimenting with a lot of ideas for a while, but I've had difficulty resting on something, and I think I'm starting to realize that was because where I was looking to as far as games go for I guess ideals or I guess just kind of references, there was a lot of dissimilarities that I hadn't reconciled. So, for example, League of Legends, I think, has some really incredible spell design. Not all champions are equal, of course, but some are really fun to use their spell combos, and there's so many different situations where you can do different things. But inside of League of Legends, there's a couple things that are very different from a first-person perspective VR game, as far as tools and things that feel good or don't feel good. And one of the things that I hadn't thought too much about was the movement component. So in League of Legends, you can tell your character exactly where to move. And you can tell them exactly where to move, and they'll take care of the rest. And during that time that your champion is following your instructions on where to go, you can very specifically do other things. So you can tell your champion to move, and while you're moving, you can look at the other champions. You don't have to worry. So, for example, in like a third-person game, you do have to worry about your character. Unless it's like an RPG game where you can click on a mini-map, your camera stays hooked on your character because all your movement controls are based on the camera being hooked on your character. Similarly, in a first-person VR game, your camera is often... Well, you can't move your camera, first off. But your camera is not ideally situated for long-term movement instructions. It's not very easy to tell to indicate where you want to move from a first-person perspective, because it's not top-down. So the distance, the longer the distance, the harder it is to kind of tell how you want to move to that position, and also indicating it. As far as like if you were to shoot a laser, becomes increasingly more. And increasingly and exponentially harder, because the angle of like kind of rotating your wrist to point becomes smaller and smaller to indicate a larger degree of distance. So like if I'm pointing to a position, right in front of me, or like within 10 feet, I can be really, really precise. Whereas if I'm pointing to a position to move 100 feet around, it's a lot harder to be precise from a first-person angle. Whereas from a top-down League of Legends point of view, you can still be incredibly precise all over the whole map. Your character's position doesn't affect the accuracy of indicating where you want them to move. So yeah, that's one kind of, I guess... That's one mechanical system that is present in League of Legends that's not present in first-person shooters or in most VR games, other than the top-down VR games where you're controlling units. Yeah, one thing that's not there that is there in League of Legends is, I guess, location precision. movement precision, and putting forth those directions. Sorry. Putting forth those directions, and then that takes care of itself. Like even path navigation will happen in League of Legends. You're not going to just run into the first wall and be stuck there. It'll take care of all of that. Whereas in a lot of other games, like first-person shooters, there's none of that. Your movement has to be tightly controlled by you at all times. It's usually not even a toggle. Like you have to hold it down, like whether it's an analog stick or a WASD, you have to hold that down. Sometimes you have to hold down a second button so that you can choose when you want to go your fastest, whereas in a lot of other games, you're just always going your fastest. That's not really a mechanic, rationing your sprint stamina or whatever you have. But in VR, that's not there at all. And I've been back and forth about movement mechanics, but in general, except from like a top-down unit perspective, if you're keeping the first-person perspective, it's quite a challenge to precisely indicate where you want to move. So what does that all mean? Why is precise movements so important? Well, in League of Legends, a lot of the fun is predicting movements, and it's very fun to move around and very easy to move around. So you're making a lot of tiny movements or movement adjustments all the time that are very precise. You're making a lot of movements all the time that are very precise. So the spell fun, a lot of the enjoyment of League of Legends spells is how precise your movement is. Lots of spells have to be within a very tight range, from skill shots to AoE to your own targeted abilities that they have to land near enemies or allies to do what you want them to do. Location precision, very, very important. So back to first-person shooters, location precision is still really, really important. As far as aiming goes, you have to be perfect with gun games, and that's kind of consistent throughout almost every game. You really have to aim at the target and as close as possible to their head or similar weak points if you want to do bonus damage, which you always want to do. So I was thinking about that and how it's frustrating to me as a gamer that I think that spell precision in League of Legends to me is way more enjoyable than aiming in first-person shooters is. And I think that comes from two places. And once again, this is my personal opinion, but I'm sure that a lot of people share this kind of subconscious feeling. Or I should say satisfaction or dissatisfaction. I think that League of Legends is more satisfying for spellcasting relative to first-person shooter shooting because with a first-person shooter, you have to simultaneously manage movement of yourself and aiming at the enemy. And aiming at the enemy is impacted in many ways by your own movement. So you're trying to do two things which are actually partially in contradiction to each other. So, classic example, if you are moving sideways to the right, and your crosshair was right over them, then as you move to the right, you have to rotate your body to the left in order to compensate for that. So while a very complex, interesting kind of combination, it's kind of annoying because in real life, you kind of do that automatically. Like, when you look at things, it's not really a conscious process to be like, well, I'm moving my head towards the thing, so I have to adjust my eyeball rotation in the opposite amount to continue tracking. No, you just think about looking at it, and you look at it. And so when we're translating into video games, the tracking of things is kind of something that we don't have to do. Now, that's why a lot of VR games really succeed with the aiming a gun, because when you move your head, suddenly your hand is completely unattached from your head. So you can remain pointing at something or adjust something completely independent of your camera, which is completely different than most first-person shooters. You have to look at what you're shooting. Your gun is your head. Or I guess you say your gun aiming is your head. Which is not exactly natural compared to what is in real life, where you've got two hands and they're completely separate from your head. And understanding aiming is understanding the perspective that your gun hand would have, where it's pointing the gun. And so understanding that, but that's a kind of spatial hand-eye coordination type thing. And I realize I'm not sure exactly how I would go about that for a non-VR game, but it's just something to recognize that is frustrating to me about first-person shooter games, is you have two mechanics which you have to do simultaneously in order to be good, which is moving around in usually an erratic manner. And then also aiming with your head, not your hand, which is not automatically adjusted by your movement. So yeah, that is frustrating. Whereas in League of Legends, I'm telling my character to move somewhere, and after I issue that command, my aiming of spells does not interrupt or make me need to instruct my movement, or like in the process of aiming, I can hover my cursor over where I want to shoot my spell while I'm moving, and it won't interrupt my moving. So of course, as soon as I cast a spell, it can interrupt my moving, because I might have to stand still to cast it or whatever. But I could move somewhere while I line up a spell without it changing in a inverse way where I have to compensate for it in my spell. Like, that'll be updated automatically. I guess if metaphorically the same thing would be basically like if every time you moved your character to the right, you had to aim not just at the champion still, the enemy champion still, you had to aim more to the left. So you have to do that in your head. Whereas, of course, because it's top down and your camera isn't fixed to your character, their movement doesn't actually affect where you need to point on the screen relative to the enemy. You might, the way that spell dynamics work, you might have to adjust your spell firing because you have like range limits, or you want something else to happen specifically because of where your position is relative to theirs. But you changing position doesn't change where the enemy is, I guess. So it's not changing your camera. You're still pointing at the enemy, if that makes sense. So like if you added a move instruction to go to the right, and then as soon as you did that, you hover over the enemy. You're hovering over the enemy the whole time, even while your character is moving. Yeah, so that would be a better comparison. So it would be like if you told your character to walk across the map to the right, and then you went to hover over the enemy with some like laser ability, and as soon as you moved your mouse to the laser ability, your mouse would continue to move along with your character, like parented to your character. So you'd have to keep sliding your mouse over to the left to compensate for the movement. Like, that would be really frustrating. But yeah, so to me, there's an aspect of that in the first-person shooter, and I know that's a lot of what makes it skillful, and that, you know, the complex combination of that and understanding how much you need to adjust is a lot of the skill. I completely accept that. I just think that there's more fun ways to select for skill and you know, have you be good or bad at the game than the ability to adjust for something that you in the real world automatically adjust for. It's a fairly subconscious hand-eye coordination thing that if you rotate your head to the right and you want to keep looking at the same things, your eyeballs will automatically look to the left. So that's not an inner calculation you have to do. Same thing with your hand. If you look to the right, say you're holding somebody at gunpoint for some reason, if you look your head to the right, you don't have to adjust your hand on the left. Your hand on the left will stay looking at something, even though if you think about it in terms of 3D animation and IK, your shoulder's moving, which means your arm bending has to change if you move your whole torso to look to the right. I guess rotating your head to the right would not affect your shoulder, but if you rotated you know, the upper half of your body a little bit to the right, you know, your hand could still look at the same thing because that's automatic. So that was a long proof. Probably a little bit too repetitive, but you get the idea. Automatic adjustment calculations happen normally in real life. So in VR, I don't want to do automatic recalculations. So when it comes to movement is tough because we're constrained within a small play area for now. Let's ignore movement for the moment and just think about strategically aiming. How do we make firing spells fun and skillful? Well, it's easy to make things skillful in a first-person shooter by having to aim and with really tight precision. I've already gone into the past why precision in VR, especially far distances, is really not satisfactory or easy to do, or, you know, just kind of rewarding in any sense, because the resolution is smallest when it gets farther away, and the resolution is a big limiting factor of VR. And of course, your shakiness of your hands become more and more of an issue the farther away and the more precise you have to aim. So I started thinking, well, what if it was more strategic in that we have shielding from multiple angles? So by default, if you want to hit somebody with like a kind of think like missile rocket spell kind of a thing, you have to shoot it straight at them. And that's because the AoE is small enough where that's just how it has to be. Now, what if there was a way to redirect your missiles where losing interest. I will continue this again later.